we got a chance to speak to Robert Besseling, who happens to be the EXX Africa's Executive Director. For more on this.
There are certainly some serious question marks whether once these various reports are fully confirmed and gain more attention internationally, whether this will indeed harm commercial ties with other countries and various African countries. The point here is that Chinese involvement at the moment seems to be tied around China's infrastructure investment programs. Whereby China is seeking a greater security role in a number of African countries where it has invested billions of dollars over the past few generations in large infrastructure projects. So certainly from a Chinese point of view, this is a security provision on top of their already existing investments in infrastructure.
Definitely, much of the conversation there says that China is doing this as a way to protect its investment in the likes of Kenya and Djibouti, and of course the port. But how much truth does this hold?
In terms of the Chinese priorities, certainly the most spoken about, most public motivations for increased arms shipments to Africa seem to be commercially motivated, simply to increase sales of Chinese weapons and military and logistics services, as any country which exports weapons would want to do. However, there does seem to be ulterior motivations where China is seeking a greater political and diplomatic role in a number of African countries in order to seek potentially votes on the UN Security Council, potentially to seek further political clout as well from a number of African countries. So this is not purely commercially motivated.
All right. Now, we do know that, of course, China is just slightly behind the United States in terms of nominal GDP, but just slightly ahead with when it comes to power purchasing parity. And we know that some of these deals that are being done with Africa are in a bigger strategy to see that, of course, China moves ahead as a global trader, and of course, in terms to the GDP conversation. Tell me, if this deal goes through and of course China becomes the biggest arms dealer in Africa, where is it likely to stand in relation to the United States?
You're absolutely right to point out that China and the US and of course Europe have been competing on various different levels in Africa for investment, for trade, and also for weapons markets. In terms of this competition, this can similarly be reflected in the arms trade. And China is seeking a greater role, as we talked about earlier, in terms of a commercial purpose, but also for further political and diplomatic motivations. So how this is likely to move forward is that China is not only supplying to major sources of investment, etc. in Africa, is also seeking out markets where arms embargoes have been placed over the past few years. Places like South Sudan, where America recently imposed an arms embargo. Sudan, of course, where the Darfur region is still strictly under an arms embargo. So these are markets for Chinese weapons which have previously not been filled. And certainly now there's a vacuum which China is seeking to fill at the moment.
All right. Now, we do know that, of course, the China-Africa conference is happening in Beijing, where we see the likes of President Museveni, President Paul Kagame, and, of course, mostly the presidents from Africa are in China. Of course, we did see President Xi Jinping coming up and rather committing $60 billion worth of investment in Africa, and these some of them are free interest loans, and some are, of course, concessional loans. But tell me, when it comes to this conversation with date trapping, that China obviously says no, it's not about that. Give me an understanding here. How much of a reality is that?
There is certainly a conversation going on at the moment and a lot of publicity given to Chinese relations with Africa because of the ongoing conference in Beijing at the moment. However, in terms of the arms trade, we have to go back a few months to June, when China also invited heads of African militaries to Beijing for the China-Africa Defense and Security Summit. This was technically, or at least officially, touted as a conference to boost regional security and anti-maritime piracy efforts. But most of the negotiations at that June conference also focused on weapons procurement from China by African countries. So those conversations happening just a few months before this major conference that's more focused on trade and investment in Beijing seems to be well timed in terms of most of the weapons procurement deals now seem to be confirmed before heading into this major conference in Beijing at the moment.
So should we expect some of these conversations to be on the table while the heads of states meet President Xi Jinping?
I certainly would not rule that out. Most of these agreements, of course, because they involve national security, are not publicly disclosed during these kind of conversations. But it would only make very good sense that generals, chiefs of military staff who have visited Beijing in the past few months and very often will be part of the conversations that are taking place at the moment in Beijing, certainly that these deals and potential weapons procurement transactions will also be discussed in ongoing conversations. But do not expect a public announcement on these.
Finally, before I let you go, how does this relate to what we saw Theresa May, the Prime Minister of United Kingdom, do just the other week in Nigeria?
Well, European countries, whether it's the UK or Germany and France, all have major weapons procurement interests in Africa. And seeing that interest slide in favor of the US and more recently China will, of course, bring up some concerns for major manufacturing and weapons armaments makers in Europe. So we can only assure that these conversations between European political leaders and Chinese leaders will also include weapons procurement deals.